Welcome back. Today we will be ranking all of the free-to-play daggers that we have available in the game. This isn't including any seasonal locked ones, mainly just the easily accessible ones such as the ones in the normal pool or in the Grail shop, and that's pretty much it. Before we get started though, I would like to go over how I will be ranking these units. I will be ranking them based on their performance rating and their cost rating. Now their performance rating is complete subjectivity based on how I believe they hold up in the current meta, while the cost rating is how easy it is to invest into a unit on a minimalistic level. Let's take Colm for example. He already comes with Pivot, Moonbow, Attack Speed 2, and a Link skill. He doesn't necessarily need as much investment as someone like Jacob would, because Jacob's kit isn't exactly the best when it comes to anything really. So Colm would naturally have a higher cost rating over Jacob, for example. And beyond that, there's really not much else to it. This time around though, I am going to rank them based on their movement types respectively first. So I'm going to go through like the infantries, and I'm going to go through the flyers, or whatever order they may be after the infantries. I haven't really decided yet, but even so, I'm going to start doing it more in line with their movement types first, and then go in order from there. So with that being said, we may as well get started with the first infantry dagger demote, Kath. Stat-wise, Kath is probably one of the better demotes that we have in the game because 3643 attack speed is really solid at base. She doesn't have a PRF to call around, so she will be outshined by units that naturally have a PRF, at least a competitive one. Even so, she does come with Armor Pin Dagger, which is basically an armor effective dagger with Hardy Bearing built into it. Not necessarily anything to write home about, but it does the job quite well. If you want to use Kath on budget, you could always just keep her innate attack res bond and speed res link, give her attack defense oath, and then speed defense bond seal, so you can basically make her into a big stat ball. It's not exactly the most optimal per se, but it does work in line with what you are trying to accomplish with her base kit, because attack res bond and speed res link, while not necessarily the best skills, can still be worked out with proper inheritables. Of course, if you want to invest way more into her, you could run Vicious Dagger with Flashing Blade, Luna, and Times Pulse. Vicious Dagger and Courtly Fan are basically the same weapon. It doesn't matter which one you necessarily have, but the fact that it has half no follow built into it means she can run skills like Wind Sweep and run Blade Session, so that way she's outputting a significant amount of damage while minimizing the amount of damage she takes in return. However, there will always be counters such as dragons and units like Ascended Fury that come with no counter disrupt, so there is stuff you have to look out for. Even so, as a demote dagger, she isn't bad by any means whatsoever. I feel like daggers have a lot more leeway with their performance simply because the amount of inheritables that we have in the game are really competitive comparatively to a lot of other inheritables. Sure, we don't have as many daggers as we do lances and axes, but the daggers that we do have access to do allow them to perform to a significant degree, especially the ranged flyers, which we'll get into later, as they don't have to worry about their B slots as much. Next we have Chad, who, while has a really high speed stat and a pretty decent HP stat, does suffer from a lowish attack stat. He comes with Rogue Dagger, which basically grants him defense res plus 6 and inflicts -6 defense and res on foes within 2 spaces, so rather than your typical -7, it's -6, and he grants visible buffs to himself. So if you do end up keeping it, it could actually help him out with his survivability a lot more, howbeit 26-23 res isn't exactly the highest anyway, and with a lot of skills in the game that can negate any sort of visible buff, it's hard to say whether or not it will be effective, especially with those bases. If you want to use him on budget, you could honestly just replace his entire weapon by giving him Barb Shuriken, Flashing Blade, and Luna, so that way he can make up for his lower attack stat at 30 base. You give him Swift Sparrow 2 with Desperation and Speed Smoke, and he should be good to go on budget. However, on premium, you could actually make him into a big true damage stat stick with Red Hot Ducks and Flashing Blade. Flashing Blade with Red Hot Ducks will give him 12 points of true damage per hit, which isn't too bad whatsoever. Combine that with Times Pulse, no follow-up, Blade Session, and Lethality, his damage output should be rather significant. However, he will have to worry about any sort of counterattack because chances are if he's not healing, then he's not going to be able to take too many retaliations, even with that HP stat. Even so, I do find that his performance is significantly weaker than someone like Kat's, and without a decent PRF to call his own at the moment, I find that he isn't necessarily going to be doing any better, if not doing a bit worse than Kath in comparison. And even though he is colorless, which does help with a lot of other matchups, I do find that 30 attack versus 36 attack and then 43 base speed versus his 37 is a pretty significant difference, even with Dragon Flowers in mind. Next we have Colm, who's basically just another Kath. He has a bit more HP, but has the same attack, 2 less speed, and a bit more res with a bit less defense. and his weapon is Quick Dagger, which grants special cooldown -2 at the start of turn 1, which is basically just Ouch Pouch. Calm is fairly similar to Kath, as I just mentioned. Even though their color is different, they're really not going to be performing all too differently at the end of the day. If you want to run Calm on budget, you could honestly just give him double attack wave with Desperation and Ideal. That way you're at least making up for his not necessarily low attack, but you're getting a lot more damage output as a result. With Quick Dagger, he can have an instant Moonbow ready to go. The only caveat will be that after the first Moonbow, he will not be able to get it off immediately on the next combat, provided that he doesn't get any sort of external support. That being said, if you want to use him on Premium, you could keep Quick Dagger and run a instant lethality set with Flashing Blade, Special Spiral, Times Pulse, and Quick Impulse. You can swap out Quick Impulse for Blade Session and then run someone with Infantry Pulse or some sort of Grand Scratcher effect, or anything that could grant him external cooldown from support. The idea here is that with Quick Dagger and all these skills, he will have instant lethality ready to go. It will reset back to 2 cooldown, and then with Flashing Blade 4, he should be able to trigger it on every second hit, provided that there aren't any guard effects. But like I was saying, he is basically similar to Kath. Kath is still better offensively, but the differences are so minuscule to the point where I don't feel like they should be any sort of ranking apart. So for that reason, I'm going to also give Calm a 6 out of 10. Next we have Felicia, who has probably one of the worst attack stats in the entire game. Even with flowers, it's a bit hard to mitigate the damage that she's going to be outputting simply because 23 base attack isn't a lot. In fact, it's really low. And even with her PRF Felicia's Plate that grants adaptive damage, it's not exactly going to do a lot against a lot of foes simply because foes by the day are getting bulkier and bulkier. And with Felicia's minuscule attack, it's going to be even harder to take advantage of any sort of lopsided defense stat. Even so, she can still run stuff like Broadleaf if you want to make up for her attack deficit. If you want to use her on budget, I highly recommend just stacking up her attack, speed, and resistance. So that way you're making her into a mage tank. Felicia's Plate is really good for taking on magical foes because of the fact that it grants additional cooldown per attack against magic foes, which is really strong. And because her res stat is really high, it's going to be harder for a lot of them to pierce through. So giving her something like Speed Res Solo, Sabotage Attack, Rouse Attack Res, and Attack Res Solo will actually make her into a really competent mage tank, and she should be able to deal with foes with her Glacies proc. However, if you want to use her on Premium, you can still go with the Felicia's Plate set, but give her Special Spiral instead, so that way she can go up against more foes other than mages. But she can set up against a mage and then have Glacies ready to go against other types of foes, as long as she's able to double. Stillwater 4, while brand new, is still really good as a skill for Felicia because defense is definitely going to be her dump stat, so she doesn't really need it as much as she does her res and attack. And then Rouse Attack Speed is good just so she can naturally double more often and output a significant amount more damage, and Attack Speed Solo for more offenses. But even so, at the end of the day, even with her lowest attack, she can still run Broadleaf. And I do think that while Broadleaf isn't nearly as amazing as it once was, it still grants her something that a lot of other units that have low attack stats cannot take advantage of, and that's just stacking additional attack to oblivion. So even the worst dagger can still bring something to the table, and I do think Felicia is one of those cases where even with a really rough stat line, she could still do work with the right inheritables. Next we have Gaius, who comes with a true damage dagger that grants even more true damage on Refine. It's pretty basic all things considered. It grants 10% of the unit's speed as true damage during combat, and then if the foe's HP is 100%, he deals an additional 7 points of damage. Whether that's with an AoE or that's during combat, as long as the foe's HP is 100%, it will deal 7 additional points of damage, which is especially helpful for Gaius specifically because 29 base attack isn't exactly that great to begin with. However, with Resplendent, he gets 31, which is fine. It's not amazing, but it still helps him out quite a bit. If you want to use him on budget, I highly just recommend giving him Double Fury Desperation, just to help leverage his lower attack stat. And from the additional points of speed he gets from Double Fury, he should be able to get at least 4 more points of true damage, which isn't bad at all on budget. However, if you want to use him on Premium, you could run a Blazing Wind set with Life and Death, Special Spiral, and Times Pulse. The only caveat with Gaius is that he can't run double Life and Death because he doesn't have Slaying in his weapon, meaning that if he wants to consistently charge Blazing Wind, he will have to run Flashing Blade for it to work. Still, I think overall, Gaius isn't the worst by any means, but I think similar to Felicia, he does kind of struggle in the attack department, and while his damage output is definitely significantly better than Felicia's, Felicia does have her niche as a mage check, which is why I don't feel that Gaius should be ranked above her in any capacity. However, you'll have to let me know down below because I can kind of go either way. Next we have Gaur, who also has a true damage weapon, except rather than 10% of the unit's speed, it grants 20% of the unit's res during combat. And if the foe has a penalty on them, he gets Spectrum 4. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned that the true damage is also tied to the penalty, but that's fine. He has an absurdly high amount of HP, which is kind of concerning because those stats could have easily gone somewhere like his attack or his res for even more true damage, but 32 isn't exactly the worst. He does have high speed though at 38, which is pretty nice. If you want to use him on budget, you could also res stack him with skills such as speed res solo, attack res solo, and attack res link. The reason I kept Panic Ploy on him is so he can be self-sufficient with his weapon. However, I do recommend that you just run another unit that can inflict penalties on the foe. And then if you want to use him on premium, you could always give him Mirror Impact with no follow-up and Menace. And then with Flashing Blade, he should be able to trigger a 2 or 3 cooldown special depending on whether or not the foe can counterattack. But with Mirror Impact and Love and Dagger, he should be getting a good amount of true damage from his weapon. And I will say that while Gaius and Gaur can be comparable in some capacity, I do find that Gaur's 20% of his res over Gaius' 10% of speed is a bit more significant, on top of the fact that Gaur does have a better allocated stat line, and with the additional stats that he grants from his weapon, he does end up with a significant amount of more stats in general, which is why I do think a 6.5 is probably fair. Although in that case, I could also raise Gaius to a 6, but I could go either way. Next we have Jacob, who's probably one of the weirder demote daggers that we have in the game. He has a Fox dagger that inflicts -4 to everything on the foe if he initiates combat, and his special refine, if he's within 3 spaces of a damaged ally, he gets another Spectrum 4, which is a bit more difficult to do unless you run someone like Winter Bernadetta. But still, if he is able to get it off, he can get an 8-point stat swing, which is pretty decent, especially with his poor stat line of 29-31 attack speed, and non-existent bulk of 39 HP, 25 defense, and 24 res. If you want to use him on budget, you could always just give him Swift Sparrow Desperation with Speed Smoke and Blade Session, so at least you could stack up his speed a bit more so he can naturally double, especially with Speed Smoke active. And then for his premium set, you could leverage a bit more on his defense stat, as he will have 41 effective defense if his PRF is completely active, and with Sturdy Impact it will become 51 defense, meaning that he can actually take a melee hit if needed. Even so, I do find that he's in a similar position to Felicia, that while his PRF is not necessarily better than Felicia's, in fact I would say Felicia's PRF is better, I will say that at the end of the day he can still fall back on stuff like Broadleaf or Courtly Fan if you really want him to. So he's never going to be as bad as another unit that lacks inheritables, for example. So I do think at the very worst, he is a 5.5. Next we have Kagero, who honestly has a really sleeper refine. I know it's a bit outdated by today's standards, but 50% damage reduction on initiation is really good, especially at max investment, as she will be able to have a significant amount of bulk ready to go. She has 35-32 attack speed, which is pretty decent. The attack is good, the speed is definitely more than workable. Her bulk is definitely shaky, however it's absolutely made up by her refine that grants 50% damage reduction on initiation. If you want to use her on budget, you could always just stack up her stats. You could give her attack defense ling with attack smoke, and then you could basically make her into a relatively okay tank. You give her Swift Sparrow 2 with Blade Session, and her damage output should be significantly better. And then on max investment, you can give her Sturdy Impact with no follow-up, so that way the only foes that can pierce through her damage reduction are the ones that A, either have no follow-up and more speed than her, or B, dual phase Brave. But those aren't nearly as common, so I do think that for what it's worth, her bulk is actually surprisingly really good, especially with Sturdy Impact in mind. You don't necessarily have to worry about making the Heavy Blade check because it can be hard to do for someone like her. So running Flashing Blade isn't exactly the worst thing you can do over potentially making a Heavy Blade check, because Flashing Blade checks are generally easier to do. And then with Time's Pulse, she should be able to trigger lethality on every second hit if the foe can counterattack. I do think Kagero's kind of a sleeper, especially with her Resplendent in mind. Her survivability is definitely her biggest boon. I will say that there are definitely better daggers when it comes to offensive pressure, but if you're looking for a unit that can consistently output damage, then Kagero is not bad whatsoever. Next we have Kaze, who honestly I believe has one of the best demote dagger refines in the game. He has a slaying dagger that grants attack speed res plus 8 and comes with flashing blade 4, meaning that he's getting additional true damage per attack if his speed is higher than the foe's. His offensive stat line isn't exactly amazing, but with his PRF active it definitely makes up for it, because 30 base attack isn't exactly anything to write home about, but with the 14 might he gets from his initial weapon, and then the additional 8 he gets from his effects, he will be outputting a significant amount of damage. And then with his speed stat of 36, and then the additional 8 he gets from his weapon, he shouldn't struggle to double whatsoever. His defense is definitely really low, so it could spell trouble if he has to go up against a foe that targets his defense. But other than that, he's actually not too bad. If you want to use him on budget, you could also just run a Desperation set. You don't necessarily want to run Fury because his weapon does have an HP condition, but if he has to go up against foes that keep counterattacking, there is going to be a chance that he will fall below 25% HP, which is why Desperation may not be the worst idea here. And then with Ideal and Oath, he should be able to output a significant amount of damage, especially with Kaze's Needle active. And then on Premium, you could also run a Lethality set. I would argue he's probably one of the best lethality users in the game, simply because he has innate Flashing Blade 4 and Slaying built into his weapon, meaning that with time spells he can have a 2 cooldown lethality ready to go. So it shouldn't be too hard for him to output a really good amount of damage. In fact, I do think he is one of the best demote daggers that we have in the game, specifically because Kaze's Needle is a really good weapon. I am going to give him a 7 out of 10 for that reason alone, but you do have to keep in mind that his survivability against melee foes can be a bit shaky, so you do have to watch out for that. Other than that, he's not bad at all. In fact, I would highly recommend building him if you're looking for a decent merge project for daggers. Next we have Chronia, who has a Vantage dagger based on whether or not the foe's HP is below 100%, that also grants attack speed plus 5. Offensively, she's actually pretty good with 31-39 attack speed. Her attack is definitely on the lower end, but with the attack bonus she gets from her weapon, it shouldn't be too bad whatsoever. Her bulk is actually not too bad, especially with Vantage active. Normally it would be a bit of a problem because 22 defense and 26 res isn't exactly the highest, but because she can Vantage at 100% HP, her survivability is definitely a lot higher than other Vantage units. If you want to use her on budget, you could always run double Fury with Desperation. I know we're back with the Fury Desperation set, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And you could also run Speed Smoke if you want to secure doubles. However, you could also swap that out for Savage Blow so she could get additional attack and speed from her weapon. And then on Premium, you could run her as a Vantage unit with Close Foil, No Counter Disrupt, and double Savage Blow. The idea here is that you initiate combat, chip the foes, and then sit down and let her take care of the rest. And that's pretty much what she's going to be doing. However, I do find that the strategy is going to be a lot more difficult for her simply because of units such as Medius that can negate any sort of outside damage, which is a problem. However, even with that aside, I do find that her damage output isn't exactly going to be the best as is. It isn't bad by any means, but 31 base attack isn't exactly the best anyway, especially with the plus 5 she gets from her weapon. So you could always do better when it comes to damage output, but as a Vantage unit, she's not bad at all. In fact, she's pretty good. Next we have Gaur, who's definitely one of the more competitive daggers that we have in the demote pool thanks to his Hurricane Dagger. Hurricane Dagger is basically the cleaner effect, which basically grants additional attack based on how many visible buffs the foe may have. It also grants 10 attack and speed, 30% damage reduction, and true damage by 5 points per attack, which is really good offensively. His stat line isn't exactly anything to write home about, but with 38 base speed and 31 attack, his offensively, he's not necessarily the worst, and I know I said 31 attack isn't exactly the greatest when it came to Chronia, but keep in mind he gets 10 more attack from his weapon, on top of additional attack based on whether or not the foe has visible buffs, which is really good because it can raise his damage ceiling by a significant amount. Because Hurricane Dagger also has an HP condition, your best bet is to set up against a unit that can make him fall below 75% HP, but not fall below 25% HP, and then he can get Desperation going. Because you don't want him taking too much damage at the end of the day, especially on budget, but if you do want to run him on Premium, you can actually make him into a side grade Volk with Sturdy Impact, No Follow-Up, and Times Pulse. You want to also give him Flashing Blade so he can consistently trigger lethality, especially if going up against foes that can counterattack. Hurricane Dagger granting damage reduction should also allow him to survive a significant amount more, especially with Sturdy Impact in effect. He will have 42 effective defense before any sort of damage reduction takes place. And honestly, I do think offensively he is one of the better demote daggers that we have in the game. 30% damage reduction may not necessarily be a lot, but with the 15 points of attack he gets from his weapon, on top of the cleaner effect that can grant even more attack, on top of the amount of speed he gets from his weapon and his base speed, he should be really, really effective as a demote dagger. Next we have Matthew, who honestly got massacred by an inheritable. His PRF is basically just broadleaf, which isn't bad at all. In fact, it's pretty good. But you also have to keep in mind that the inheritable can be refined for attack, and it has Dagger 7 built into it, meaning that it can effectively match his weapon, which is really sad to think about, because if it were just on Matthew, he'd be ranked a lot higher. Because 25 base attack is not good. It's not good. He has 34 speed, 30 defense, which is pretty decent, and his weapon does grant additional defense and res, but there are other means of buffing his visible stats, so it's not exactly like the most coveted effect, unless you want it for self-sufficiency. If you want to use him on budget, you can just make him into a Vantage unit with Attack Smoke and Speed Smoke and Fury Vantage. Pretty simple, and yeah, there's really not much else to it. You do want to make him to a Vantage unit just so he can output a significant amount of damage and can function in both phases really reliably. And then on Premium, it's basically just an upgraded version of his already budget Vantage set, except you could run Speed Smoke 4 instead of Attack Smoke 3 in his C slot, so that way he can also get damage reduction in case he misses a kill. Even so, similar to Felicia, his attack is pretty low, and she can pretty much match Matthew in a lot of circumstances with an inheritable, which is why I do think Matthew isn't exactly going to be ranked any higher than a 5.5, simply because his weapon is pretty much inheritable with broadleaf, so I don't think it's really worth ranking him above, even if it is a pure F. Next we have Saizo, who honestly got a really cool refine. It's basically a Plaguean dagger to an extent, except rather than doubling the amount of penalties the foe may have, it grants stats to himself based on the amount of penalties active on the foe, which basically equates to the same thing in some aspects, which isn't bad whatsoever. His offensive stat line could be better. 29 attack isn't exactly the highest, but 34 speed is pretty okay. 33 defense isn't bad at all, but 16 res is pretty abysmal. But with his weapon active, he's basically getting a 12-point stat swing, which can leverage his attack, speed, and defense a lot more. If you want to use him on budget, I highly recommend just making him into a stat ball with Fury 3 Mystic Boost. So he's not taking chip damage, but he is still getting stats for it. And then Speed Res Link and Attack Defense Oath, so he can get even more visible stats. And on Premium, you could use him on the enemy phase as a lethality user with Brave Lucina support with Close Foil, No Follow-Up, Joint Drive Attack, and Attack Speed form. With Saizo Star active, he should be able to live a significant amount of hits and output a significant amount of damage, especially when paired with Brave Lucina, which is really, really nice. And honestly, I don't think Saizo's too bad of a unit, to be honest. I know he isn't exactly the greatest when it comes to a lot, but his weapon is something that can't really be replicated by other inheritable daggers, which I do think gives him an edge over his competition. But even so, I do think that overall, he can be pretty menacing with max investment. So I do think a 6 out of 10 is fine, but I can swing either way. Next we have Soth, who was one of the earlier daggers with a really, really solid offensive stat line. Even with his Resplendent active, he still has 38 base attack, which is really, really good, and 35 base speed, which is really nice. His weapon is basically similar to Brave Veronica's PRF, in which it inflicts debuffs on foes and grants visible buffs to unit and allies within 2 spaces, which is really nice, except rather than -4, it's -5. And then for his special refine, he gets Attack Speed 4 and Pulse Smoke, and accelerated cooldown to himself and allies within 2 spaces. I do think that the spatial condition is a bit more gimmicky than it's worth. If anything, the accelerated cooldown is going to be better for him combatively rather than supportively, because I do think the spatial limitation is what's going to hurt his supportive capabilities. But as an offensive unit, it's not bad whatsoever. If you want to use him on budget, you can keep his innate life and death with Desperation. Desperation, again, because he has an HP condition of 25% or more, meaning he doesn't want to fall below 10 HP on budget, so it couldn't hurt, again, to run a Desperation set just so his survivability and damage output is significantly better. And then on Premium, you can run him with a Blazing Wind set. Even though he doesn't have a slaying effect in his weapon, he can still run Special Spiral with Time Spells and Double Life and Death, simply because he does get accelerated cooldown after combat, meaning that he will essentially get a 3 cooldown Special Spiral, which is pretty good. And honestly, as a unit, he's definitely one of the best demote daggers that we have in the game. And even though his PRF can be finicky, comparatively to other daggers, he's still really decent. So I do think a 7 out of 10 is pretty good for him. Next we have Tethys, whose stats basically don't matter outside of her HP and res. She has the cleaner dagger, which is whatever, because at the end of the day, she's not really going to be entering combat. She's a dancer that supports, and that's basically it. Tethys' budget and premium sets aren't really going to differ all too much. If you want to use her on budget, you can just go triple sabotage with double tactic, but on premium you could just stack up her HP, run Tamari, and sudden panic with another tactic. But the difference in effectiveness between the two aren't really going to be too big. I will say though that triple sabotage is really coveted, especially for a dancer. So I do think that you don't really have to even do too much with Tethys, simply because of the fact that her res is really high, and Tamari granting sabotage attack speed with sabotage res as her B slot is going to do enough work for you. Which is why I do think that a 6.5 out of 10 is good. There are a lot of units that can replicate her niche, but the fact that she's able to dance is really, really nice. However, she does still compete with other dancers, which is why I do think a 6.5 out of 10 is fine. Honestly, I can lean towards 7, but I do think it's fine as is. Next we have the Dagger Armor, starting with Winter Cecilia, who comes with Goody Boot that basically grants a bunch of defense and a bunch of res based on how many allies are within 2 spaces of her, which is pretty good for budget because you do want to make her into a bulk monster with her armor status. 35 base attack is pretty good, 23 speed is whatever, you don't really have to worry about that, and then 30 defense and 36 res isn't bad whatsoever. If you want to use her on budget, you could just give her a double form with quick riposte and defense ploy, so that way she's just stacking up her best stats respectively and outputting a significant amount of damage. And then on premium, you can actually invest into her defense a bit more with Courtly Mask and a defense refine. Courtly Mask also grants attack and res, so her tanking capabilities will definitely favor her res more than her defense, but that's fine because with double distant defense and DR far safe, she should be able to tank a lot, especially with damage reduction coming from Courtly Mask. And honestly, I will say she's probably the best accessible dagger that we have in the game at the moment, simply because she's an armor and not much else. She does the job quite well, and yeah, that's the status of being an armor. You're good because you're an armor. Next we have Winter Jafar, who comes with Minty Cane that heals himself for 5 HP every time he attacks, which is fine. It's not exactly the craziest weapon, but it does the job if you needed to. His offensive statline is pretty good at 35-37 attack speed, while his bulk can definitely be better, even though 31 defense is alright and 27 res is okay, but 44 HP helps a bit in that regard. If you want to use him on budget, you can honestly just make him into a stat stick with double bond, speed res link, and attack smoke. And then with Minty Cane paired with it, he should be a big stat ball. And then on premium, you can actually use an Ouch Pouch lethality set with special spiral. Granted, you could also do something with Savvy Fighter, but I find this to be a lot more fun. So with Ouch Pouch active, lethality becomes a 2 cooldown special, and then every time a ranged unit attacks, so long as he doubles and there aren't any guard effects present, he will be able to trigger lethality on every second hit, which is really nice. And then if you give him attack res far save with speed res form, he should be able to tank a significant amount of damage from ranged foes, so you don't have to really worry about it all too much. I will say he's a bit worse than Cecilia because at the end of the day, having more natural bulk is better than doing something like Savvy Fighter, especially against foes that can attack twice. So for that reason, I'm going to say that Winter Cecilia is a bit better than Jafar, but Jafar is not bad by any means, especially since he's an armor. Next we have Hatari Dean, who comes with Bone Carver, which is basically the base effect of Deathly Dagger that inflicts 7 damage to the foe he attacks and foes within 2 spaces. And it also grants attack speed plus 5. Offensively, he's actually pretty good at 36-39 attack speed. His HP is decent, but his defense and res are not good whatsoever. If you want to use him on budget, you could just make him into a chip pot with Wind Sweep and Double Savage Blow, so that way you're just acting supportively rather than focusing on anything else. And then on premium, you can run a Barb Shuriken set with lethality. So Barb Shuriken will make lethality a 3 cooldown special. With Trace and attack speed, menace, and catch, he should actually be able to make heavy blade checks pretty easily. It will be a bit more difficult because heavy blade checks are harder to make than flashing blade checks, but with attack speed, menace, and trace and catch, he should be getting a significant amount of attack right out of the gate, which is why I do think that he should be able to run lethality pretty well. Overall though, he's still rather generic, and even though he's on a cav, which means he's inherently worse skill-wise when it comes to just everything, the inheritable daggers definitely make up for it. which is why I'm not going to be as harsh when it comes to the cavalry ones, simply because his stat line isn't bad by any means, and I do think that with the inheritables in the game, he should not be able to struggle as much as other units of his archetype would be able to. Next we have Merlinus, who's Merlinus. He has 20 attack and 50 HP and yada 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 yada. It's Merlinus. What do you want to do with him? If you want to run him on budget, you may as well just make him into a support unit. You run Panic Ploy with chill attack, HP plus 5, and distant guard. Doesn't matter what the special is because he's not really going to be doing anything damage-wise. But it's Merlinus. Everybody loves him. And then on premium, you can actually try this really interesting set. A friend of mine actually recommended this a while ago when he first came out. Basically, the idea here is that you want him to act as a Wings of Mercy beacon and Aether-Raid's defense. So with Courtly Mask and Deflect Magic, he should be able to survive a good amount. And that's assuming that A, the foe is able to double, and B, that he isn't doubling himself. The idea here is mainly so he gets damage reduction and he survives. That's pretty much it. There's really not much else to it, but it's Merlinus. What can you do with him outside of support and yada yada yada? I guess you can use Broadleaf, but like, I don't know why you would with Merlinus. Unless you like him like I do. But even so, I think Merlinus has earned the first ever Merlinus out of 10 ranking. Cost rating is really high simply because all he really needs is supportive skills that are rather accessible, so I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem there. And finally, we have the Dagger Flyers, who, while they are ranged, do not struggle as much as other ranged flyers simply because they can run Courtly Fan and Vicious Dagger. So I'm not going to be as hard on them as other weapon types simply because of that. Camilla comes with Ouch Pouch, which is basically Quick Dagger. Offensively, she's okay at 33, 35 attack speed. Bulk-wise, she's not really that great, but that's whatever. If you want to use her on budget, you can honestly just put her into a Flyer Ball and run Flyer Formation with Attack Speed Form and Attack Speed Bond. And with Ouch Pouch and Glimmer, she should be able to output an okay amount of damage. But on Premium, you can actually run Courtly Fan with Wind Sweep, Rhine, Attack Speed Catch, and Blade Session. She won't be able to do as much as someone like Dean will be able to do, simply because she can't really run Trace too well because she has 2 movement. And she can't really run Lethality or Heavy Blade too well because her attack set isn't exactly that high. But even so, she shouldn't be able to struggle as much as other ranged flyers would, which is why I'm going to give her a 5.5 out of 10. Even with the likes of Felicia and Matthew and Jacob, I do think that she does have access to a good amount of stuff, which is why I'm not going to be as harsh with her as I would with other units. But it's still entirely possible that she may struggle just as much, if not more. And then the final unit on the Dagger list is New Year Air, who comes with Tamari. Offensively, she's okay at 31 attack and 36 speed. Her bulk is whatever, but she does have good res at 34 base. If you want to use her on budget, you can just make her into another Tethys with triple sabotage, double tactic, and that's about it. But on premium, you can actually run Ouch Pouch with Blade Session and a bunch of other stuff that inflicts attack penalties on the foe, so her survivability is a lot better. The idea here is that you have a one-time lethality ready to go. Of course, you can still charge it after the fact, but with Ouch Pouch making lethality 2 cooldown special, if she's able to double and there aren't any guard effects present, she will be able to get lethality ready to go. Still, similar to Camilla, offensively they're pretty much the same. Support-wise, it's whatever, and they're pretty much ranged flyers with a good amount of accessible skills, which is why I do think that a 5.5 is more than fair. And yeah, that's about it for the Dagger video. I think this one was a lot more straightforward, simply because a lot of the Daggers do perform the same, but the gap isn't nearly as bad simply because of the inheritables that we have in the game. But you'll have to let me know what you think down below. If you agree with any of this or disagree with it, leave a comment. Tell me why you disagree, tell me why you agree. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, thanks for watching.